At 12:42 p.m. on July 20th, 1944, a bomb exploded in the briefing room at Adolf Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters. Planted by Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, the explosion fired the starting gun on an attempt by dozens of German officers to usurp control of the state from the Nazis in Operation Valkyrie. This is the story of who they were, just how close they came to success, and the price they paid for it. By July 1944, the war situation for Germany was approaching catastrophe. In Normandy, the Western Allies had landed and were engaged in brutal fighting to push inland, while in the east, Operation Bagration was in full swing and had driven the German front line deep into Poland. Time was running out for Germany, which also meant it was running out for a network of officers within the Wehrmacht that was plotting against the Nazis. Opposition to Hitler from within the Wehrmacht had been around in some form for years, but this particular movement was centered around Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, a charismatic 36-year-old with a talent for organization and persuasion and a determination to see Hitler dead and a new government put in place. Like many of those involved in the plot, Stauffenberg had started off supportive of Hitler's government, but had been radicalized against it both by the catastrophic management of the war effort and a recognition of the atrocities being carried out by the German state across Europe. In April 1943, Stauffenberg had been caught in an Allied air attack while stationed in Tunisia, losing a hand, an eye, and 2 fingers on his left hand. After a lengthy recovery in hospital, in the autumn he was recruited for a desk job at the headquarters of the Reserve Army in Berlin by General Friedrich Olbricht. This brought Stauffenberg into a developing conspiracy against Hitler, led by Olbricht and Colonel Henning von Treskov. Together, through the end of 1943, they worked on a plan to topple Hitler's regime and bring a new German government to power that could, they hoped, negotiate a peace with the Allies. The biggest obstacle for the plotters was their lack of widespread support within the army or society at large. They were, as Nicholas Stargardt puts it, an isolated minority, without the support of the army's most senior officers. There were some at the very top who were sympathetic to the plotters, but none were prepared to stick their neck out, embodying a deeply ingrained tradition of obedience to their commander-in-chief. When asked to join the resistance, Field Marshal von Manstein had replied that Prussian field marshals do not mutiny. The Reserve Army was a potential way around this lack of support. It was a force of around 300,000 troops spread across Germany, made up largely of soldiers home on leave, training units, and other miscellaneous forces. Importantly, in the event of any civil or military disturbance within Germany, it was the Reserve Army that would be charged with maintaining public order by securing key locations across the Reich in what was known as Operation Valkyrie. Stauffenberg and Treskov soon developed a plan which would see them assassinate Hitler and then use Valkyrie to seize control of the German state, all while blaming a dissident group in the SS for the assassination, creating a pretext to declare martial law, disarm SS units, and arrest its leaders. In late 1943, with planning underway, Treskov was reassigned back to the Eastern Front, leaving Stauffenberg as the main organizer in Berlin. Over the coming months, he refined the plans and sought out others across the military and other state bodies who felt the same way about Hitler. By the summer of 1944, Valkyrie had a number of powerful friends, including the Berlin city commandant General Paul von Hasse, who under the Valkyrie orders would take command of troops in Berlin. The key obstacle now was actually carrying the assassination out. By this stage in the war, getting close to Hitler was difficult, and several different schemes were considered but failed to come to fruition. In June, the Western Allies landed in Normandy, which turbocharged the plotters' desire to act as soon as possible. They could feel the end of the war drawing near and were desperate to put their opposition to Hitler on the historical record before it was too late. At the start of July, Stauffenberg was made Chief of Staff to the head of the Reserve Army, General Friedrich Fromm. Fromm was not part of the conspiracy but had knowledge of it, and had allowed his junior officers to carry on with its planning, keen as he was to be on good terms with the winners if they were successful. This appointment meant that Stauffenberg would be able to attend briefings of Hitler personally, creating the opportunity he needed. Stauffenberg resolved that he would plant a bomb himself during one of these meetings. This was not ideal, as it meant that the colonel would spend much of the day of the coup travelling to and from Hitler's HQ, rather than fulfilling his critical role coordinating Operation Valkyrie from Berlin. After several false starts, on July 19th, news came through that Stauffenberg would be required at a briefing the following day at Hitler's Wolf's Lair HQ in East Prussia. This time, the one-armed colonel was determined to see the assassination through. He was under no illusions as to just how difficult it would be to pull off, but the chance of success no longer mattered for many of those involved. As Treskov had told him the month before, the assassination must be attempted whatever the cost. Even if it fails, we must act in Berlin, for the practical purpose no longer matters. What matters now is that the German resistance movement must take the plunge before the eyes of the world and of history. In the early morning of July 20th, 1944, Stauffenberg was driven from his house on the outskirts of Berlin to Rangsdorf Airfield, where he met his adjutant, Lieutenant Werner von Heften, and boarded an aircraft bound for the Wolf's Lair. Each man carried a 2-kilogram lump of plastic explosive in their briefcase. The plane landed at 10 a.m. and by 11:30 Stauffenberg and Heften had travelled into the secure compound known as the Wolf's Lair, where Stauffenberg went into a preliminary briefing with Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel. An hour later, the colonel made the short walk across the compound to the briefing hut for the conference with Hitler. His bomb was now live, with a 15-minute detonator ticking away. He was supposed to be carrying both bombs, but an interruption meant that only one had been armed in time. On arrival, Stauffenberg entered the briefing room and took a place around the map table as close to Hitler as he could get, and placed his briefcase on the floor. He waited for a minute or two and then left the room, making an excuse about needing to make a phone call. Stauffenberg then left the building and strode over to the compound's communication building, where Heften was waiting for him with General Erich Feldgiebel, who was a member of the conspiracy. There they watched as at 12:42 p.m. an explosion ripped through the briefing hut ahead of them. The bomb had exploded, the coup had begun, and now every second counted. Stauffenberg and Heften leapt into a waiting car and sped back to the airfield, believing Hitler was dead, while Feldgiebel shut down communications at the Wolf's Lair. The picture inside the briefing hut was one of carnage. The heavy oak table had been cracked in half and the building wrecked. 4 of the officers inside the room at the time were dead. All had been stood close to the briefcase. Hitler, stood just a little further away, was injured but alive. Had Stauffenberg been able to arm the second bomb, or even if he had put the extra explosive in with the armed device, there's a good chance the explosion would have been strong enough to finish the job. The assassination attempt had been a failure, but that was far from the end of the day's story. In Berlin, the epicenter of the coup was the Bendler Block, the headquarters of the Reserve Army. There, General Albrecht and Colonel Albrecht Merz von Kirchheim anxiously awaited news. Joining them was General Ludwig Beck, who was to become the new head of state in the coup, General Erich Herpner, a former panzer general who had been sacked by Hitler some years before, and General Fritz Thiele, the Reserve Army's communications chief. At 1:30 p.m, General Feldgiebel at the Wolf's Lair opened a line to the Bender Block and spoke to Thiele, telling him something terrible has happened. The Fuhrer is alive, before abruptly putting the phone down. This vague message gave the plotters no information and left them in some doubt as to whether the assassination attempt had even taken place. As a result, they hesitated, waiting for more information before making any moves. Precious time slipped by. After several more hours of mixed messages, at 4 p.m. Stauffenberg landed at Rangsdorf Airfield and Lieutenant Heften rang the Bendler Block, telling them that the attack had been successful and Hitler was dead. With this, Albrecht finally decided to issue the Valkyrie orders. Shortly before 4 p.m, Kirchheim called together senior Reserve Army officers and told them Hitler had been assassinated and Operation Valkyrie was being activated. When General Fromm was asked to sign these orders as Commander-in-Chief of the Reserve Army, he protested that he did not believe Hitler was dead and refused to issue the orders, deciding at the decisive moment to side against the plotters. As this discussion was ongoing, Stauffenberg arrived back at the Bendler Block and swept into Fromm's office, affirming again that Hitler was dead. When the general still refused to issue the Valkyrie orders, the others overpowered and arrested him, putting General Herpner in his place. At 4:30 p.m, the Valkyrie II orders were issued to every district of Germany in the name of Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, a conspirator who took up the mantle of head of the armed forces after Hitler's presumed demise. The orders began with a declaration. The Fuhrer Adolf Hitler is dead. A treacherous group of party leaders has attempted to exploit the situation by attacking our embattled soldiers from the rear in order to seize power for themselves. In order to maintain law and order in this situation of acute danger, the Reich government has declared a state of martial law and has transferred the executive power to me together with the supreme command of the Wehrmacht. Any resistance against the military authorities is to be ruthlessly suppressed. Captain Karl Klausing oversaw the transmission of these orders, but in a critical mistake he ordered it sent with the highest secrecy classification, which dramatically increased the distribution time. This had huge implications, especially after the communications blackout at the Wolf's Lair was lifted and Hitler's staff began to pump out messages assuring the nation of his survival and instructing that orders from the Bender bloc were to be ignored. Of the 18 districts across Germany, in 6 the Valkyrie orders arrived too late for any action to be taken, and in 3 more Field Marshal Keitel was able to contact local commanders first and prevent them following orders from the plotters. Only in 5 districts was any action at all taken under the Valkyrie instructions, including Berlin. More success was had in Paris though, where more officers were actively in on the plot. More than 1,200 SS and SD personnel were arrested on the orders of the conspirator general Karl Heinrich von Stauffenberg. In Berlin, on receiving a phone call from the Bender bloc at 4 p.m, General von Hasse began to mobilize his troops, beginning with the Großdeutschland Guard Battalion, commanded by Major Otto Remmer and stationed close to the city centre. Remmer was known to be a convinced Nazi, but Hasse had refused suggestions he should move him out of the city during the coup, arguing that when push came to shove, the Major would obey his orders. The plotters also mobilised units from outside Berlin, including the armoured training units based at Krampnitz under Colonel Wolfgang Glassamer, who was ordered to use some of his troops to occupy radio transmitters at Königs Wusterhausen and take the rest into central Berlin, where they would be used to help Remmer's forces secure the government quarter and protect the Bender bloc. By the late afternoon, Major Remmer and 3 of his companies had arrived to be briefed by General Hasse and ordered to their positions, which they took up by 6:30 p.m. The government quarter was sealed off, but already Remmer was having doubts about what he had been ordered to do and began to suspect that he was being used. At 7 p.m, Remmer went to visit Joseph Goebbels at the propaganda ministry to try and find out what was going on. Remmer wasn't the only one having doubts. Colonel Glassamer was also uneasy, and around the same time went to the Bender bloc to get clarity. By this point, the headquarters of the Reserve Army was a hive of activity, as the plotters conducted a war by telephone, frantically ringing local commanders all over Germany and occupied Europe to try and shore up support as news of Hitler's survival spread and orders from the Wolf's Lair countermanded their own. When he arrived, Glassamer spoke to Olbricht, who repeated again that Hitler really was dead, but the colonel by this stage was not convinced. When Glassamer expressed that he wouldn't be cooperating with the Bender bloc any longer, he was seized by the conspirators and prevented from leaving. The Valkyrie plotters could do nothing about Remmer though, who at his meeting with Goebbels was put through by phone directly to Hitler, who was able to confirm that he was, in fact, alive. Hitler then gave Remmer broad powers to crush the attempted coup and arrest its leading members alive. Around the same time, a radio broadcast announcing Hitler's survival aired across Germany, with the Valkyrie plotters having failed to take control of radio and broadcast stations quickly enough to stop it. After this point, the morale of the remaining plotters dropped dramatically, as the telephone war was increasingly a lost cause. Even officers who were known to be sympathetic, like General Otto Schellert in Kassel, had ceased to follow instructions from the Bender bloc. Now it was clear that Hitler had in fact lived. At 7:45 p.m, Field Marshal von Witzleben arrived in a flying rage. Witzleben was furious at the way things were unravelling, with seemingly no army units under their command, and broadcasts from the Wolf's Lair having been allowed to go out unhindered. The old Field Marshal spent half an hour berating Beck, Olbricht and Stauffenberg, and then left, to go home and await his fate. Support now drained away within the Bender bloc itself, as more junior officers who were not part of the plot began to question their orders. A delegation led by Lieutenant Colonel Franz Herbert went to see General Albrecht, and after a short discussion left with the impression that their bosses were involved in a coup. At 9 p.m, news reached the plotters that General Hasse had been arrested by the Gestapo. The last few friends Valkyrie had were being removed from the board. By about the same time, Major Remmer had regrouped his troops at the Propaganda Ministry, and he sent Lieutenant Rudolf Schlee to the Bender block with 2 platoons to put a cordon around the building. The arriving troops were spotted outside by the plotters, who began to arm themselves. Stauffenberg awkwardly held a pistol in the 3 remaining fingers on his left hand. Elsewhere in the building, Herbert's group were now also arming themselves. At 10:50 p.m, they stormed down the hallway with weapons drawn, demanding to see General Fromm. The commotion quickly escalated when Stauffenberg and Heften approached, and Lieutenant Colonel Karl Pruden tried to seize the one-handed colonel, and shots were exchanged. Stauffenberg was hit in the arm and wounded, as Herbert's group then bundled Albrecht away to find Fromm, who had earlier been moved upstairs by Herpner. Stauffenberg staggered into Fromm's ante-room and joined the other plotters. He rang Paris, telling General Stulpnagel, who had just finished taking more than 1,000 SS men into captivity, that all was lost. My assassins are at the door. Shortly afterwards, Fromm arrived, now very much back in control. The plotters were disarmed and lined up. Operation Valkyrie, the July 20th plot, had failed. Understanding what was to come, General Beck asked to keep his pistol so that he might die by his own hand. Fromm agreed, before without breaking stride moving on to the other conspirators. Fromm knew that his earlier toleration of the growing plot against Hitler would spell the end for him unless he silenced those present, and fast. He convened an immediate court-martial that has pronounced the following sentence: General Staff Colonel Mertz, General Albrecht, the colonel whose name I will not speak, and First Lieutenant Heften are condemned to death. It was just after midnight. The 4 officers condemned were hurried downstairs to meet their fate by firing squad in the Bendler Block courtyard shortly before 12:30 a.m. Immediately after July 20th, a vengeful regime began a massive program of arrests. On August 7th, a series of show trials began, the first wave of which included Field Marshal von Witzleben and Generals Herpner and Hasse, along with Captain Klausing, who had ordered the transmission of the Valkyrie II orders. They were all sentenced to death, and over the coming weeks and months, dozens of others would follow. More than 7,000 people would be arrested, with executions continuing right up to the end of the war. This included General Friedrich Fromm, whose rapid execution of Stauffenberg's group late on July 20th did not stop him from being executed himself in March 1945 for cowardice in failing to stop the plot happening. The July 20th plot was the last desperate gamble by an opposition to Hitler that had been frustrated repeatedly over the course of 6 years. Stauffenberg and others knew that if they were going to act, it had to be that July, as the war barreled towards a cataclysmic conclusion for Germany. The historian Joachim Fest argues that the purpose of July 20 was the gesture itself. It was its own justification. In other words, the plotters knew they would probably fail, but were willing to go ahead anyway, as an act of self-sacrifice to try and clear their own conscience, free their fellow soldiers from the oath of loyalty to Hitler, and save as much of Germany's substance as possible from the impending catastrophe. Fest recalled that prior to July 20th, on average 1,588 Germans had died on each day of the war since 1939, and that after July 20th this rose to 16,641. It was some part of this devastation, all of it long after the war's outcome was certain, that the plotters hoped in vain to prevent.